Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to join us. I'm Ashlyn Burgett, your moderator for today's webinar. I would like to welcome everyone to today's session on internal and external network vulnerabilities. This is the second installment of our Think Like a Hacker webinar series, and we're so excited to get started. Let's go over just a few things before we dive into our discussion. All attendees will be muted throughout the session, and the session is also being recorded, and all attendees will be receiving a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slides in your inbox tomorrow. Just a little bit about KirkpatrickPrice before we get started. KirkpatrickPrice is a licensed CPA firm in PCI QSA, providing assurance services to clients worldwide. Our firm has over 13 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. We also offer information security services such as audits and pen testing, as well as readiness and guidance on frameworks such as SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC for cybersecurity, PCI DSS, HIPAA, HITRUST CSF, FISMA, ISO, and GDPR. We also encourage you to connect with us by subscribing to our blog, visiting our library of recorded webinars so that you can catch up on any series at any time, and following us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I'd also like to remind everyone that this presentation is provided by KirkpatrickPrice for educational and/or informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. No attorney-client relationship is established by viewing this presentation, so should you need legal advice, please consult with your attorney. And with that, I'd like to welcome our speaker for today. Stuart Rohrer is a penetration tester here at KirkpatrickPrice and has more than 10 years of experience in security testing. He has a wide range of experiences, but his focus has been on mobile and web applications, as well as IoT devices. Stuart also holds a variety of certifications that make him more than qualified to be speaking to us about penetration testing today. So welcome, Stuart, and I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here again, and I'm looking forward to this presentation. I always like to get out there and share what we find during our assessments in hopes that you can take that information and improve the security of your environments. And of course, come to us if there are any issues or questions that you might have, especially if you're interested in having your network security tested. Today, we're actually going to be discussing something that's been in the eye of the security world for quite some time, and that's going to be networks. One of the original elements that have been tested over, many years, a lot more years than what people actually realize. Nowadays we seem to think that the security field is something new, but in actuality, there has been lots of security testing, going on from, the 80s and beyond. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into our presentation. So today's agenda is primarily, again, going to be on networks. We talked previously in another session about web applications, but today we're going to be focusing on, the network aspect of a company's environment. And so our agenda first is going to be covering, slightly what's the differences between an internal and external, because I know that can sometimes be a little bit confusing for those folks that are maybe not in a technical role. And we'll be covering some common findings that we typically discover during an assessment. Some of them might seem to intermingle, but there will be differences enough that you'll be able to look at these and then compare them to your network and see, where you might fall into one of these categories. So let's begin. So again, internal versus external. It's something that's very important to understand before we proceed. Internal networks, you're typically going to find things like client workstations. You're going to have internal servers like domain controllers, your mail server, your database. You'll find routers and firewalls, maybe something like intrusion protection systems. You're going to find functional devices like faxes and printers, scanners. Whereas in an external network, you're more often going to find things that are intended for external use, for use outside of your company. Things that you might find there are like a firewall. A firewall is put there hopefully to filter traffic between the outside world and your inside world. You might find web applications, which are there to interact with the outside world, and then they, in that sense, will speak internally to the servers you have, and they get the answers they need, and then send that info back out to the outside world. All of this occurring, between certain, network zones of a person's network. But again, the web application is sort of that face that the outside world interacts with. You would never want someone on the outside to interact directly, per se, with an internal server. And then you might have external services, things that are sometimes seen, maybe not as much anymore, but you would see file servers like FTP and SFTP that I remember companies used to have them to provide files for clients to download. Now we're seeing a lot of that being performed over cloud environments. So, these are becoming a lot less found, but some are still there. And, mail, while it's mostly internal, there are some companies that have sort of like an external mail presence. And of course, if that's the case, that definitely needs to be analyzed for security, but you do find them from time to time. Now, if we're to go into it just a little bit more detail, think of internal environments primarily as a domain, an area for your internal users to access internal assets that they would need to function. So think of walking into company A, and inside company A, you see a secretary, you see your human resources staff, and all of them are using computers, and they're networked, and they're connected to some servers that are inside of, say, that company's building. Now, external environments, again, something that's more than likely exposed publicly, are going to be available to the outside world. They're going to be able to be touched without, say, having to walk into that building. So that's how I typically try to explain it. There's really, you can always find flaws with anybody's explanation, but we're trying to sort of make it a simplistic way that you can envision a difference between, say, what is internal and external. And the reason that we're doing this is because when we go over some of these issues, we're wanting to make sure that, one, you understand where they occur, and by understanding the difference in the domains, you can understand also the severity of the issues, and why that they might be common. And it'll just make a lot more sense. It'll be a lot more cohesive for you during this presentation. So again, we have those environments, the internal and external. So if we move forward, let's go over to our first issue. And I call this one configured to fail because it's actually one of the more common categories of issues that we find during a penetration test. And those are, in fact, configuration issues. Now, configuration issues do occur in both the internal and external environments. And by configuration issues, I mean that things like servers or services that they haven't been configured correctly. And one of the most common issues that we find, actually, and I have it listed here, are default passwords. You would be surprised to see how often that you might do an assessment and you would find, say, a router that still has some of the basic, default usernames and passwords. I can recall an assessment where I found actually an intrusion protection device that had the default usernames and passwords on it, and I was able to use that to go further into the company and actually exploit it to a great deal. So configuration issues, again, things like passwords, we're talking things like group policies, anything that can considered a configuration within a network is sort of in this type of domain. And the problem with this is whenever, and if you've ever been involved in creating or setting up a network, there are always so many elements that you have to configure. So it becomes really complex. And a lot of these little configurations start to pile up. So one, it's very easy to forget about them. Two, when you're trying to get everything to talk to each other, it can be very difficult. So that is another reason that a a lot of these exist because you're working more along the lines of just trying to get them to talk. And then once they are able to talk, you're hoping that they don't break. And then so a lot of times people will just sort of leave things as they are. And we happen to know that not everything is fresh, or say fresh outside of the box, as we have listed here. Default settings do not mean, best security, and we have discovered that over the years. So again, things that we typically look for are weak passwords, and that in itself, we talked about default passwords, but weak passwords are also an issue. It's still amazing to see how many people will allow very simplistic passwords like password 123 or let me in and things like that. And so we find these on appliances, like I've mentioned before, intrusion detection, firewalls, internal applications, internet applications. There's a lot of security problems around those, network accounts. It's amazing how often you will find that a company might even outsource some of their technical work. And they have a company come in, and that company has an account that they use to get into that company to perform fixes. And that account just happens to have a really simple password. And, sometimes when we're looking at those networks and we are able to, to gain a list of user accounts with just a simple, brute force attack, you're able to actually gain a pretty good foothold with just those types of things. Even printers, faxes, scan machines, believe it or not, they also fall into this category because, a lot of them nowadays come with a user password feature. They hook into your domain. They can authenticate to the domain and allow a person to maybe scan something to a user folder. And if you leave the defaults on those, an attacker can easily get into those and then maybe dump a password list or the hashes that have been stored on there, or they might be able to even bypass some of the other security features on there to use it to their advantage. And there have been many attacks. And I remember one a few years ago at DEF CON that was presented that people were actually able to own the network just through like a scan printer fax machine. So what to do? Anytime you're dealing with configurations, ultimately what you're going to want to do is test your configurations, and the one thing you're going to find that we're going to suggest throughout this whole webinar is, that is to focus on having your network tested primarily at least with an annual penetration test. That is one of the best ways that you can test those configurations, and you're doing it by an outside party that is, going to hopefully come in and it's like a fresh pair of eyes. It's good to also test it internally, and I do recommend that. If you have something set up where you're testing your environment internally, that's great. But I always think that there's something to be said for someone who is not, say, necessarily involved with the initial setup or, dealing with it on a day-to-day. A fresh pair of eyes can always do some amazing things. They can find things that you would not believe, and that's what we do here at KirkpatrickPrice. So another issue, and this again falls under configure to fail, is, of course, and we're sort of hinting at this earlier with some of what I was talking about, but the misconfigurations that are found within an internal network. So on the past couple slides, while we did touch on this, a lot of misconfigurations, say like in outside, we mentioned firewalls, default passwords on those. That would be something of an example for an external network issue. Now, when we were talking about the faxes and such, that would be more of an internal issue. But there's actually more than that, because there are other misconfigurations just, beyond the default passwords and weak passwords we just spoke of. So other issues that exist actually occur, based on poor configuration of, say, the operating systems inside of an internal network. And by that, we'll talk about, say, Microsoft with the null session vulnerability. Believe it or not, that has been around for more than a decade, and it still is. I mean, we still see the null session vulnerability. And what that is typically is where an anonymous person can attach to like an IPC share without a username or password, and then it gives them enough of a connection that they can actually pull some information about the network that they can use to their advantage. There might even be a list of usernames or open shares, and then from that they can sort of keep stair-stepping until they are able to maybe obtain a password to a user level account. There's also the fact that there are still open shares on networks. We see that quite often where, say, a company is trying to make it easy for, let's say, again, the human resources department to access files from, say, another department. And there's just a constant issue with them trying to, maybe they keep forgetting the password or something, and then someone's like, well, forget it. We'll just make that share open. Well, that can be a problem. That can be something that can be exploited. And so those are types of things that we look for. Group policies on internal networks, especially within the Windows environment, are a very common area that we find and are able to exploit, because when you're going through them and setting them up, it's so easy to make a mistake. And that's definitely one of the areas that should be tested. It can be very tricky, and I remember as a systems administrator, it was always something that I was playing with on a very constant basis, because there was always changes to the network, and where the policy might work for one group, for another group it's almost like you had to do something a little bit different. So staying on that top of those can be hard, but again, that kind of is what makes it such a great target. Items falling into the mindset of it's inside, so it should be safe. And we'll actually talk about that a little bit later. But, that's a very common mindset that we see. And going back again to our last slide about the default and weak passwords, that's one of the things that will fall into that category. Some of the tech people will say, well, it's a firewall. How many of our people are going to be looking for that IP on our network, and how many people are going to know how to access that web page, and then are going to go out and Google the default username and password for it, and then even if they are in it, how are they going to even know what to change? Well, believe it or not, people are very intuitive, and most everybody, I would say, knows how to Google, so it can actually be quite common to see that those types of things do happen. So again, what can you do? Well, one, don't rely on ignorance. Like we just talked about, don't hope that because something is or seems obscure that, others aren't going to figure it out. In fact, it's better just to go ahead and, just assume that people know exactly what you know, if not more, and to do your best to secure it. Again, test your configurations, check them, do them yourself. Have some other team members who are on your staff to check them. But again, even more importantly, if possible, have an annual penetration test performed. That's what we do. I mean, our life is lived around studying security, vulnerabilities, and issues, and learning the ins and outs of operating systems and all types of technology out there. That is what I guess you could say that we live, breathe, and do. So use us. So our next category, I call it patch me up. And this one, happens a lot more than what it really should. Externally, we will often uncover outdated, older unpatched services, especially when there are web applications involved. I find that a lot of times because people initially develop a web application based off of a certain platform and framework. And then when a new upgrade comes out, even if it's, for security or maybe adding in new features, it breaks the web application. And the developer's like, oh, please don't do that to us. Just give us time. Don't update it just yet. And then that time becomes a year and then 2 years, and within that time, something can be exploited. Other services to consider as well that are often old and unpatched are FTP. On the outside, mail, we've talked about some of those. It's very common sometimes to even see where a person, we talked about people moving into the cloud, where they had an FTP server once upon a time. They decided to phase it out. They're in the cloud, but they sort of just left the FTP server there and open. that's a problem because it's still a service, it's still running on the network, and if it gets old and outdated and a vulnerability is found for it, it can be exploited, and then someone can use that as a foothold into your network. So then moving into, say, the internal realm, we'll often see things go a step further. In addition to, say, some of the above services, because, FTP, mail can be found internally as well, we'll often find operating systems that are outdated. And that's a bad thing, especially considering we actually still see a lot of XP and Windows 7 machines. And those have a ton of vulnerabilities, out there that can mean almost insta, admin stat or instant system is what we typically go for. But, those are all things to consider. So if you're currently running any XP or 7 machines, you definitely need to try to find some way to convince, the higher ups to allow you to upgrade. And that brings us to, what do? Well, you update where you can, you patch for any, issues that that are available, stay on top of all those services that you have. And that's, I think, the harder thing. I think that's one of the main reasons that we see people fall into these categories. Is because, one, it's not simple. It's not typically most, networks aren't just going to offer a service. There are going to be several. And as a company expands, whether in people or in the services that they offer, you're going to find more technology thrown in to help manage things. And with more technology, there's more to stay on top of. And it becomes really hard. I think that I've seen that the most successful companies have a software that they use to keep track of the services and the software and everything that they have. And then that way they can sort of see, what versions they're running, and they can sort of go back and make sure that everything's staying up to date. When a company does that, it makes it a lot harder for us to exploit things. Typically that is one of our go-tos when we're inside and we're trying to, gain further access. Again, we're going to look for things that are old and unpatched because that gives us our window in. So if you're staying on top of that, that definitely makes our job a lot harder. So this brings us to a third category, which you might be thinking, well, wait, why is this in here? Especially considering in just a previous webinar, we spoke about web applications. Well, the reason is web applications are actually part of both internal and external infrastructures, and they are in essence a service. And considering that they are part of the network, they also become part of our potential paths of attack, and therefore part of this webinar. And web applications have been and will continue to be a growing issue. I mean, that's just a fact. They do provide a plethora of potential attack vectors. And that's because that they're accessing a lot of common backend services. And again, we go back to that previous conversation we just had. The more services there are, larger attack surface. And that's kind of what we're going with here. With a web application, you're going to be hitting, say, a database server. You might be hitting a mail server that interacts in any way with a backend mail server. It might be doing some sort of internal functions, heading maybe a web app server on the back end and, calculating this and sending that data forward. So there's a lot going on. Externally, web applications are a common target. When attackers are unable to find anything wrong in the infrastructure, one of the first things they're going to do is look and see if there's a web app to see if there might be some way that they can use that to get further into the inside of the network. So with that being said, on the external front, we did say briefly that this is also an internal issue. Internal web apps are, in fact, often overlooked. In fact, in a lot of our conversations, especially when we're on a sales call, we'll discuss the internal environment and whether or not they want any of their intranet applications assessed. Amazingly, you'll find that they'll say, nope, we're good there. We don't need that. And a lot of the common trains of thought are that, well, they're internal, so an attacker would have to have physical access, or they'd have to somehow, be an employee, or no one would be interested in attacking an internal app. Why? I mean, it's boring. It's our time management, software or something like that. But that's actually far from the truth, because attacks often come from the inside. Think about it. You have disgruntled employees. Potentially you have infected computers that allow internal access to remote attackers. Even that other scenario that we mentioned before is very possible. It's very easy for people to gain access a lot of times to the insides of a company. In fact, in the news, just I think the other day, they were talking about how a hospital had pretty much been shut down by ransomware. And if you think about it, well, does that deal necessarily with the, say, an internal intranet application? Well, not necessarily, but there have been attacks where when something like we mentioned, malware, gets inside, it will look for potential bugs to exploit, and it doesn't care if the application's inside or outside of your network. If it finds an IP address that contains this service and is vulnerable to what it's trying to exploit, it's going to hit it. So there are definitely reasons to have those intranet applications assessed. And that brings us to the takeaway. Make sure that they, the internal, are assessed along with your external apps. Make sure that those are tested and secured. I can recall quite a few engagements that I've been on where I was unable, because the infrastructure had been fairly well secured, to make to escalate my privileges, and then I would find an internet application. Well, web applications are one of my sort of bread and butters, and I was able to use that to get further in. So please, if you learn anything from this webinar, that's one thing I want you to learn, is that your internet applications are just as vulnerable per se as external apps can be. So that brings us to our next category, and this is interesting because in essence, this does fall into the configuration issue that we spoke about before, but we wanted to mention it separately because it's one of the most common attacks that is used when exploiting a network, and that's using a tool called Responder. And that's not the attack itself. Responder is just the tool, but the attack actually works because of the way that Windows environments operate. So typically what will happen is if a target cannot resolve a name through the DNS server, it will fall back, because that's how Windows operates, to name resolution through LLMNR and MBTNS. And what will happen is with those, you can fool them. Thus the title of fooling internal servers. And that's what Responder will do. It acts as a tool that will send requests that the target thinks is legitimate, and it tells it that the traffic should be sent to us, the attacker. So in essence, Responder will be used to redirect traffic that we can typically take, examine, and use hopefully to exploit something within the network, maybe gaining hashes, something along those lines. And Responder is an awesome tool. I mean, it cannot just be used against one target, but many. And a lot of networks have been compromised within seconds just through the use of Responder. It is, again, one of the primary tools that we see for attacking. Now, this would be for an internal network. And as I mentioned, it is an excellent resource for gathering credentials. Now, how would you defend against that? Well, again, this is another configuration issue. And one of the best ways to, defend against it is to disable, those protocols that we had mentioned before. With those gone, that makes it a lot less, the LLMNR and the MBT, it's going to make it harder for, this to function and to work. For us to say, gather some hashes and things like that from, the network. Well, that brings us to our final category, and we call this the weakest link. And this is another one that you might think, well, why is this in a network, presentation? But, as most of you who are familiar with cybersecurity might have guessed, the weakest link to an organization is often the employees themselves. And this is included because it's important to realize that not all attacks against your network are going to be coming, say, from a computer or from the internet. Attacks can easily come through a phone conversation or even in person. there's no hard rule that says that you have to be hacked, through the computer. And so one of the quickest ways into a network is through the act of social engineering, which is deceiving others into giving out sensitive information. And what's more is that it doesn't necessarily need to involve, as we mentioned before, a computer for the attack. In fact, as we said before, it was just simple human conversation or interaction. And the avenues of attack are endless. There are lots of different ways that sadly we see each day that people are exploiting others to divulge information, or to say click a link that will allow them to be compromised and let the attacker come into the network. And of course, the whole, I would say, premise of the idea of social engineering is that it's exploiting, human weakness or characteristics of humans that can be exploited, such as the desire to help, a person's element of fear. There have been successful social engineering calls where people have threatened a person, or they pretended to be a higher level person in the company, and there's, maybe talking to a temp who's just, only worked there for 3 days, and the attacker's pretending to be, say, maybe a CFO and saying, look, I need you to fix this now. Here, I'll do it myself. Give me your password right now. Silly things like that. It sounds silly when we talk about them, but they actually work. And again, there are a ton of them out there. Some of them have even been, just simply piggybacking off of a person. Now, I think one of the most common examples that has been performed in the past, and quite successfully, is to use a female tester, especially if it's on a rainy day, to get into a building, have her wait and look for a male that's getting ready to go into the building. And it doesn't always have to be a male, it could be a female as well, but it seems to work more with the males. And have this, female tester go up behind him as it's raining, have no umbrella, sort of run, and, oh, I forgot my key, and like, oh, don't worry about it, I'll let you in. Chivalry is not dead, right? So, things like that can easily become the vital stepping stone that an attacker needs to take control of the network. And that's something to be considered when you're building the security around your network. Make sure that you include, policies, on that, that would stem from, say, a social engineering attack. Make sure that there are certain constraints and, put into place that, that we wouldn't allow that. I know it's hard not to be kind or nice to a person. That's, I think, probably one of the hardest things for me, because, if I was in that scenario, I definitely would want to open the door for her. But at the same time, you've got to protect your assets. And sadly, sometimes that means looking like a jerk. So here's an example of, say, I guess you would say a phishing attack, where a person has sent what looks like a voicemail message. And a lot of people would click this, like, well, shoot, not a lot of people are going to be so technical that they're going to be like, I use this type of voicemail system, and I know it's going to send me this, type of file, or it would never send me an email or such and such. Instead, a lot of people are going to be so busy in their day, they're going to see a new voicemail message. Oh, wow, maybe something's wrong with my voicemail. Oh, well, hey, how nice. It sent me this link right here, and I just have to click it. And then they click it. And it happens to be, an executable, and then it runs, and then it installs malware on their computer, or it creates a backdoor. This is a very, simplistic example of how something like that could be used to gain a foothold in the network. And so again, if you are on the technical side of this, your job is to make sure that those types of attacks can't happen. And of course, some of that is involving, of course, antivirus and anti-malware, services, so that they can scan and hopefully weed out some of this, including proper spam filtering, so that it will also weed out some of this. But even more importantly, educating your employees so that they know that attacks will come through this avenue, and staying on top of it. Maybe even having a program where if somebody receives this type of file and they're educated to the point that they know it's wrong, that they send out an email to the technical staff, and they say, hey, this attack came through, you might want to alert some of the others in case they also are being targeted. So things like that are very helpful in defending against these types of attacks. So the takeaway, again, have your networks and your applications tested. And while you can work hard to secure your network, you'll never know again how well it will stand up against an attack until it has been submitted to the, a proper type of testing. And so for that, again, we're recommending and preaching the gospel of pen testing, because it is one of the best ways that you can sort of put that network and its configurations into a testing zone. And again, as we had just mentioned, the social engineering, that is something we do as well. And we also offer that, when we scope out our engagements. And I will have to say that it is probably one of the most successful avenues of attack that we find. So if you do decide to move forward and reach out to a firm for testing, make sure you also ask about the potential for social engineering attacks, as well as even physical security. That's something that definitely needs to be tested as well. But that's our presentation. I really hope you enjoyed it. Definitely looking forward to hearing any of your questions and your comments. But, until then, hope you stay safe.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Stuart. Just to sum that up, we do also offer network penetration testing services. If you are interested, you can find more information about that out on our site. And Stuart did mention that if you do have questions, you can feel free to post those in the Q&A feature in the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll get back to you with answers within 24 hours, or you can email Stuart directly using his email that is posted on this slide. I also just want to remind everyone that we will be having more of these Think Like a Hacker webinars over the next few months, so please stay tuned for updates on those. I want to thank you all so much again for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.